First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the last lecture team, for this wonderful opportunity. I thought about this lecture a lot, so I hope it shows. Can you all understand me well? Okay. So, roads. Where we are going, we don't need roads, is a famous quote from the 1985 movie Back to the Future. It was very popular because it spoke to people's imagination of being able to engineer the future. However, in reality, as I will argue, it now looks more as if where we are going there are no roads at all. And if only because of this, for every person to have a decent life on a healthy planet, we need a radically different dialogue between generations and between cultures. One of global inclusion of everybody, everywhere, in every generation. A tiny seed for such a huge transformation could lie in our collective resolve to live our own life as if it lasted many generations. This I will try to argue from my own life's experiences, and hence the idea is totally unscientific, not supported by any research that I know of. So shouldn't a 64-year-old scientist know better than to confuse young minds with such idealistic small talk? Well, this is my last lecture, isn't it? And the idea is a deep conviction based on the story of my life that I will tell you about. During my lifetime, we entered the information age. It has brought us great expansions of knowledge and unimaginable potential for technical advances. And at the same time, we have come to realize that we don't know where we are going. Ironically, all this potential has opened doors to unforeseeable developments. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I searched the attic for a stack of cards. Actually, they were my code, my computer code for my PhD, but I couldn't find them. So this is the nearest thing, this stack of envelopes is the nearest thing that comes nearest to a subroutine that I had to evaluate complicated integrals, numerically. Most of you probably have an app on your computer or your phone right now, especially if you are going to take calculus, which can do 1,000,000 times more than this stack of cards. If my hearing is permanently damaged, it's not from loud music, but from the racket of machines that punch these cards one by one and then read a whole stack of them into the computer in order to submit a program. All these gadgets have sizes ranging from a goat to an elephant, and actually one of the early computers I remember was called a zebra, but much bigger than that. I also recall how in the early 80s we debated the advantage of ordering 2 megabyte of memory rather than 1 megabyte. And the difference in cost would buy you about 100 iPads today, and you needed a bigger room because of the size and the heat such an extra megabyte generated. All this is already amazing, but if you were a scientist or an engineer, or if you loved science fiction, you could have guessed that this would happen. We knew from semiconductor physics and later on from what we started to call nanoscience, where all this might lead, even though we could hardly imagine it at the time. But what I would like to call unforeseeable is the broad impact of this ever tinier hardware on society and on personal well-being. The World Wide Web, okay, we could have guessed that in hindsight. But what about the impact on all the ambiguous implications of social media, both in our personal lives and in everything that drives the world events? A nut can set the agenda of the President of the United States these days by one tweet. I think we could hardly have had a clue before it actually was about to happen, or, more disturbingly, before it had already happened, without us anticipating anything substantial about it. So to stay close to home, it's a good thing that in this information age we take training in liberal arts and sciences very seriously as a small part of how to raise awareness about where we stand and where we're trying to go. This I see as a great paradox of our time. We have never had more knowledge at the touch of a button, or more potential for innovation to better our lot, and at the same time, like never before, did we realize that already our next step would take us into territory that could not be charted. Where we are going, there are no roads. As so often with the paradox, I think the best thing to do is to take it for granted, because there is no real contradiction. We are well positioned to fully exploit our scientific potential in all fields and influence our destiny. But we can only do so if we band together globally, if, as a species, so to speak, we deliver a united and concerted effort, and this is only going to happen if every human being feels included. This global inclusion, economically, politically, socially, is so far away that it sounds like a half-baked idea of an aging idealist. You only have to tell in last week's paper all the horrible conflicts between people everywhere. Yet I believe this is what we should work at nonetheless, doggedly, over decades ahead. And my main message is, living your own life as if it lasted generations, many generations, could be the spark to start the engine of such a transformation. Let me try to sell this idea to you, or rather, let me sell you to this idea, by telling you more or less the story of my life. I have been very fortunate in my life in many ways. Of course, like everyone else, my family has had its setbacks and difficult times. I need not dwell on those tonight. But in order to make my case, a couple of my good fortunes will pass by. The first one is that I actually have known 3 of my grandparents really well, and that I may, at least statistically, hope to be part of my grandchildren's life until they are, say, your age. Those grandparents are no distant memories, nor are they there just in my genes. They contributed to shaping the person that I am, and that I was then and that I am today. To bring this to life, let me introduce the generations that came before me. This is a painting of my grandfather, my mother's father. You see, no coat of arms. He was from a family of farmers. He is reading a Catholic newspaper that doesn't exist anymore, and he was always smoking a cigar, even in this painting. The painting is now in my study, where my eldest granddaughter sleeps when she stays overnight. We then have to take it off the wall because she likes Halloween, but she doesn't like the ghost of her great-great-grandfather in June. My grandfather had a big orchard with every kind of fruit and vegetable, chickens, bees, rabbits, and a single pig. This orchard was a garden of Eden to me in the early 1950s. When I was a teenager, most of my debates on human nature, politics, religion, would be with him. He was simply around all the time. He died in 1975 at the age of 87. On that same day, a year later, I defended my PhD thesis. That was also the day my father told me he grew 1 foot taller because of my achievement. And also on that same day, 35 years later, my second granddaughter was born in Boston. This is the windmill of my other grandfather. If you look closely, you can see him standing on the hill, and even his bike in the doorway. He was from a family of windmill builders. But in each generation, there was also someone who preferred to be a miller himself, like my grandfather. But he was a great carpenter in his spare time, and I remember spending time in his workshop going over the endless array of pieces of wood. I inherited his carpenter's gene. That's not right. In this picture, you see my mother in school at perhaps 16. She lived to be 85, and she and my father got 9 children, of which I'm the oldest. She was an only child herself. We lived with my grandfather until we were with so many that it appeared that he lived with us. My mother and father were exactly the same age. Their teenage years coincided with the Second World War and they married young. As a result, they missed out on an education that they fiercely insisted their children have. To my mother, who was very down to earth, seeing her children grow up was fulfillment by itself. When she enjoyed yearly vacations in the Alps at the age of 80, she undoubtedly thought of the days that she presided over our trips into foreign countries like Belgium and Luxembourg. My father, who was outwardly a more emotional person, always kept searching for broader personal development until he died at a rather young age of 70. Here you see my father and me at the age, him at the age of 84 and me at the age of 1. The trees are still young. We're sitting in the long grass of the orchard there. He had just taken over his father's windmill and electrified it because the vanes had been destroyed in the war. At this time he would still deliver sacks by bike, but soon he would buy huge Chevys, also to carry a growing number of children in the back seat. This was way before the time of seat belts, let alone the sophisticated car seats that my granddaughters travel in today. He enjoyed driving these cars. He wrote weekly newsletters to his customers, which he stenciled on a machine that you may have seen in the museum. And he carried on the traditional family business until most small farms had vanished due to EU policies, and the Netherlands eventually counted more pigs almost than people. By now, my wife of almost 40 years and I have lived together far longer than we lived alone. We are proud parents of 2 sons. Here you see the 3 of them last summer. Our sons had treated us to tickets of Leonard Cohen, who performed in the Olympic Stadium in Amsterdam. Leonard Cohen, together with songwriters and singers like Jacques Brel, Joan Baez, and Bob Dylan, had been common favorites of my wife and me from the days before we knew each other. Leonard Cohen still, or rather again, tours the world at the age of 78. To us, he has not lost his magic, and he happens to appeal to the next generations as well. Here you see another picture of the 3 of them. We are not impulsive buyers, at least not of new stuff. When we have bought something on the spur of the moment, it often had a history we liked, and it was not always small. Here it happened to be an old barn in Normandy. You see the boys looking at me. Dad, what on earth have you done? Is the message. Indeed, what had I done? I gradually realized that I had brought myself back in time, just like in the famous movie, to the region where I had been born, to the orchard of my grandfather, to meadows with flowers, to small fields of oats and barley, rather than the monotonous cultures of corn that have destroyed all this in the wake of EU subsidies on milk and the demands of upscaling our agricultural businesses. Here in Normandy, all of this still existed. And now, after many years, there's an added dimension to this barn that I will tell you about in the end. With the same intensity with which we feel connected to previous generations, my wife and I are a real presence in the lives of our grandchildren. Let me introduce the youngest generations as well. Here is my eldest granddaughter, 2, having a little quiet time. And here she hears something really outrageous. And she says she's having none of it. She doesn't believe it and she won't do it. And then, of course, she is arguing with her grandfather. It is of all ages, grandchildren arguing with their grandparents. And this is a recent picture of the whole family. They're watching a circus act. While as kids, some 60 years ago, we considered crossing the border into a neighboring country a momentous occasion. 3 of the family members in this picture are American by birth and Dutch by descent. And this is me, as I stand here. The way I see myself, a blend of my ancestors, of course with strengths and weaknesses that are not the subject of tonight's talk, luckily. What may be relevant for my message tonight is this. I consider myself a realist, but one who insists on idealistic pursuits. An intellectual, but one who chooses to be naive if it widens the playing field of his mind. Someone who likes to explore deep insights, but who equally values working with his hands. A very rational, but also an emotional person. Someone of principle, who sees the borderline of opportunistic behavior emerge rather soon, who believes in loyalty, especially to causes, and in people, primarily in dignity, education, and opportunity for all of us, for others as much as for myself. It feels as if my life spans 5 generations. Over 200 years of human energy, ambition, joy, sadness, highlights and setbacks. But also, when you scale it up, over 200 years of mankind's development. From the Industrial Revolution gathering steam to the yet unknown implications of climate change. From Mendel's not understood genius to a deciphered human genome and yet unknown vistas of combating disease and food scarcity. From the explosive that made Alfred Nobel rich to the post-nuclear arms race and yet dark premonitions of how we will combat each other when everything from fresh water to rare minerals will come in short supply. From the intellectual achievement of scientists who still had to guess what was inside the atom and had no computational power or data storage whatsoever available, to people like you who have no personal recollection of the era before the information revolution. Some of you, as you sit here tonight, will dazzle us with the invention of quantum computers and artificial intelligence in a way that is unimaginable right now to all of us. Some of you will be creative in finding solutions to global economic challenges, sustainable development and healthcare. And some of you will create beauty, rest and reflection for people in places where we will have to live with even more of us in the future. I just said when you scale it up, but can you scale it up, the personal life that I advocate, to the level of the community of people? I have no idea, but I believe strongly that we should find a way to do that. Another good fortune in the context of my message tonight is the fact that I never physically experienced war. In my own life, there was never an ominous knock at the door calling me to combat. I even escaped the draft eventually because in my generation, baby boom generation, there were too many of us to have us polish our rifle every day. Does this mean that war was always very far away? No, it was not. In many different ways. I already mentioned what the Second World War meant to my parents and how this was critical for the way in which they raised their children. Rather than showing you some of the shocking images of war, past and present, that are etched in our minds, or that may even be part of your own experience, I would like to show you some rather more benign personal images that regularly cause me to contemplate war. In this picture, you see my grandfather together with all his brothers and their father and mother. They all wear uniforms because they were all mobilized in 1914, at the eve of the First World War. That's why their only sister is not in this picture. Luckily for them, the Netherlands remained neutral. Not so lucky were the British young men in the cemetery in northern France. One of many such seemingly forlorn places amidst fields of wheat, potatoes, sugar beets and corn that I passed several days several times a year on my way to Normandy, another great field of battle. Young people your age senselessly sacrifice to the interest of the day, so that others could live the kind of lives that they didn't want to give up. Or, as the cross may be, young people who died for the freedom and the quality of life of other future generations. What of their lives? Have they been forgotten? Not by those who tend their graves to this day. And while I hurry regularly past those places for more than 20 years now, I have finally honored them too by sharing this with you. But why did they need to go? Why were they forced or let go in the first place? Will we ever find a way to negotiate our differences without such cataclysm? Here you see a shell. It's German and it says 1943 on it. We dug it up in our yard in Normandy, where we were planting some new hedges, the very same kind of hedges that made the Allied forces who landed on Normandy beaches underestimate the fierceness of battle to come. Those hedges were perfect hiding places, and that is when I think of war these days. When I was fit for combat myself, the war that was most immediate to me was Vietnam. Here, people my own age, with whom I identified, protested, suffered and died. Here people fled the draft, sang biting songs, and were shot while protesting on their own campus. This war was part of my daily life as a teenager in the 60s. This decade was loaded with struggle and near escapes from destruction. The struggle for civil rights, against apartheid, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mao's Cultural Revolution. It was not just an era of the emerging Beatles and flower power. The murders of John and Robert Kennedy and of Martin Luther King still send shivers down my spine whenever I see documentaries about that time. Many fierce battles centered on all these events. These events also formed me and taught me valuable lessons, especially when I finally met Americans myself, by living in the United States for many years. For instance, employed as an assistant professor of physics in Ohio with colleagues that were active in the American Civil Liberties Union. Ohio, the same state where only a decade ago the violent death of students at Kent State may have heralded a turning point in the Vietnam War. So here is my central theme again, from this perspective. How are we, how are you, how are our children and grandchildren going to benefit from all the opportunities that the future could bring and cope with all the threats that would come along with it, without major conflict and critical degradation of our living environment? Of course, we don't have the beginning of an answer. We can safely say from our knowledge of history and human nature that we will not be able to ban ecological onslaught and war and injustice, not altogether and certainly not in short run. But I have come to believe this: if people everywhere of all living generations would consciously live as if their lives extended over many generations, past, future and present, we should be able to find a shared way of living our lives, respecting and actually exploiting cultural differences. This would eventually unite people to live in the interest of sustaining life itself. And as a result of that, and only as a result of that, people would have the best possible life as an individual throughout that accidental period that each of us actually walks around. I told you this lecture would not be rocket science. This plea to include many generations in your own life may sound odd for someone who grew up in these magical 60s of the previous century, when the young generation asserted its own claim to shaping the future. I still remember sitting up late with my grandfather in 1969, watching Neil Armstrong, who died recently, land on the moon, on a TV set that we didn't even dream of having 10 years before. That is where the belief in where we are going, we don't need roads, was cast in stone, or rather imprinted in moon dust. Then the information revolution really set in, and for a while it made us bolder and bolder. In 1986, just days before Ronald Reagan quoted tonight's title of the talk in his State of the Union address, as if people could still firmly believe that we would need no roads, the spaceship called Challenger exploded during launch. Reality had hit us. Doubt set in and gradually made way for insecurity. And this has never left us since. Now tires are burning, the word terrorism has come to reflect a daily reality. We are scared and ignorant despite our access to knowledge. We need to regain confidence in what we can do and in what we cannot. This is why it's so disturbing to see innovation reduced to jargon by people who do not realize that they themselves have no clue about it. To see basic research and those who practice it in all fields suffer from suspicion. To see the lure and the pressure of media to soup things up in advance, to make us angry right away, to pit us against each other before we even have time to consider carefully what little facts we know and what precious ideas we could develop. I can imagine that we could start with our extended life experiences as a basis for a revolutionary global dialogue. Taking the perspective of one's own family, its genetic makeup, its history, its present concerns, its aspirations, would be something that naturally appeals to every person on earth. But this perspective should become integrated in a way of living that makes the balance in all of our lives more robust over more extended periods of time. In some cultures, people live with the acute presence of their ancestors, but are often more apprehensive about the future than need be. In others, people are only just beginning to enjoy a decent life, and in yet others it looks as if every generation has to fend for itself, insisting on a future that can be adapted to their needs and wishes, as if it could still be engineered, like in the movie Back to the Future. Facts and ideas, together with amalgamated experience of many generations, those may be the only things to go on in territories ahead that cannot be charted. In circumstances that will keep changing in the same amazingly fast and unpredictable way in which they have changed in my own lifetime. One of the tenets of living one's life as if it lasted many generations is to instill a feeling of the enormity of change in a single person's life, handing down a palpable sense of life of one's ancestors and the way in which they coped, and testifying to the transformations in your own life, charging your children and grandchildren with a sense of continuity, purpose, and optimism. You have to stand in the tradition, hold your own ground, and be prepared to break away from all that you hold true and dear, all at once. There goes the bullet. Mentors and heroes. To achieve this, I strongly believe we all need mentors and heroes in our lives, as our previous speaker has also mentioned. An extended family, so to speak. At least that is how I look back upon some of the special people in my life beyond my family, and I hope that you will meet and recognize such people in your life as well. Here are my favorite mentor and hero. I'll tell you what they meant to me and what I learned from them. To the left you see Bob Silver. He was a professor of chemistry at MIT. He made my American adventure possible of 6 years by inviting me as a postdoc to the United States in 1976. To the right, you see Richard Feynman, the famous Nobel Prize winner in physics, who was actually an undergraduate student at MIT long before I was born. Bob Silby, who died far too young about a year ago, was one of my mentors. Richard Feynman, one of my heroes. I was very fond of Bob, and I never even met Dick Feynman. And I guess that's the biggest difference anyway between a mentor and a hero. One is often a friend, the other a distant role model. For all their differences, I saw many resemblances between them as human beings. Resemblances that resonated between them as human beings. Resemblances that resonated in turn with me. Let me tell you about some of those, secretly hoping that I will briefly be your mentor by doing so. Here is a list. Some speak for themselves, but I will come back later. The first one is an appeal to keep learning all your life. Doing so will turn you into a teacher if you have the urge to share what you're learning with others. And if you manage to turn that into a joint experience of wonder and excitement, you have become a good teacher. Stand by your man or woman does not necessarily mean that I'm advocating the lifelong marriage that Bob and I had. But it refers to the loyalty and the support in deep personal relationships. You might also read Feynman's moving story in a little book with the title, What Do You Care What Other People Think? Let me give you one example of a situation that I suspect would have struck the three of us in a similar way, as fun and serious at the same time. So, these are two green lines near a steep curve, 50 centimeters apart. What do you guess they are?
A bike path?
Right. A bike lane. You wouldn't have, it's not as wide as a bike's handlebar. So, I guess here, someone in the city council asked, what about the lampposts? And then the alderman said, don't worry, think about the big picture now first. We'll worry about the details later. And then, of course, when the first bike tripped in front of a car, they tried to improve the concept. And this tells you that it's very hard to improve a concept which is no good at all. And also it's very easy to improve a robust kind of plan, like university plans. So, I guess that this is funny, but it's also very sad. It's okay that someone invented this, but it's sad that no one came along to say, let's not do this nonsense. Let's not implement this plan. So, as you will have noticed, I have not even mentioned our common background as researchers so far. And this is because, in hindsight, it does not appear to be one of the most important things anyway. But here, in the above paper, you see all of us come together in the way this often happens in science. A paper that Bob and I wrote about something that carries Feynman's name. It's a nice paper with some good citations, still very true and perhaps useful in the future to someone, but it's not essential in retrospect, not to me, nor to science. Feynman earned the Nobel Prize for deep insights in electrodynamics without wasting his time afterwards on the admiration circuit, but making sure the whole truth became known about the cause of the fatal accident with the Space Shuttle Challenger that I mentioned in relation to Reagan's State of the Union. How fate can make the path of unlikely companions cross. Fellow scientists may remember Feynman primarily from the famous diagrams in field theory that carry his name. More people will remain inspired by his example as a teacher, but I guess many more people will watch old footing in the future to see him drop a rubber ring into liquid nitrogen on TV to make it instantly clear how the Challenger and the people in it could have perished, and how insiders actually could have known that this was an accident waiting to happen. Bob collected many friends from all over the world just by doing very nice science with them and by inspiring many generations of MIT undergraduates with his student-focused teaching. He established a school, not so much in science as in the art of education and the art of living. At his memorial in March, he was remembered as MIT's best citizen. He could stand egos without having to be one, and he served the institution by doing so. I'm a member of this school. Bob's invitation to come to the States meant a lasting expansion of my horizon, introduced me to teaching and learning in the United States, and laid the root of my future contribution to the foundation of this college, of which I will remain very proud every time I ride by the front gate. In the second paper that you see, my name is on it alone. I consider it the best paper in terms of intellectual challenge. It was the final paper for my PhD. But my Chinese-Dutch thesis advisor, who had ended up in Suriname after the Second World War, being separated for most of his life from part of his family in China, had told me he did not want his name on the paper because he had made no essential contribution to it. He instilled me with a sense of ethics in science for the rest of my life. If we were living our life as if it lasted many generations, everyone would still have this basic attitude today. From these two papers, you see my own role as a supervisor evolved. My name is in a more modest spot, but I still contributed, and I stopped publishing such papers when I became too busy to contribute to content, first as a dean of physics and astronomy, then as a dean of UCD. Two of my graduate students on these papers are now professors themselves. As you can see, their inauguration is a moment of joy and pride for their supervisors as well. All got their PhDs in theoretical physics, but the field they work in today is physical chemistry, cognitive neuroscience, and veterinary epidemiology. To close off this episode about my scientific journey, let me recall when I was first involved in research myself. Here you see the cover of a book written by my biology teacher. I went to a then still sort of elite grammar school in Eindhoven, and many of my teachers were friars in the Order of St. Augustine. My biology teacher had a PhD, like many of them. His was in biology from Leiden University. He had written a biography about Gregor Mendel, who was, as you probably know, also a priest in that same order. The main point of this biography was how Mendel had not received proper credit for his genius. I wish my teacher could have lived to see the deciphering of the human genome. He would have been flabbergasted. He would have probably not grasped the full scope of this and the impact on society, despite his PhD in biology. But small consolation. I'm here today trying to live my life of many generations to substitute for him, making sure that my grandchildren keep being amazed by these developments rather than to take them completely for granted. But I'm deviating from my original story, which is a bad habit that people who have been in my classes know all too well. My grandfather's orchard was bounded by a brooklet which long since has made way for housing development. When I was 9, it was the border of enemy territory. At the time, we had what we call a band of Indians that practiced sneaking through the high grass on Saturday afternoons and the neighboring farmer didn't want us on his land. When I was 16, it was the site of my first scientific collaboration. I collected data on this little flower. It grew in abundance in early spring on the shady borders of the brook. We were researching the thesis that the variability of some standard features would increase as the growing season drew to a close. My teacher had suggested that we look at the number of petals, of which there are many. Boy, did I count petals during the course of a few weeks. His thesis was confirmed, and he published the result. The good man forgot to acknowledge my contribution in the paper. But then, credit is what you know you have done. In hindsight, what is the importance of this to me? When I was sitting down many decades later in my backyard on Sunday afternoon, drafting 3 pages of ideas of what was to become Junior College Utrecht today, I was still driven by this experience, the excitement and satisfaction of being properly challenged in high school. And when I shop for vegetables these days, and I see how corn on the cob exhibits more irregularities when the season is almost over, I think of this gentle biology teacher, brimming with indignation on a daily basis about the underrated genius of Mendel. This is how it is. In the end, we will be remembered by small things. Now, before you think life is all about using your brain and dealing with heavy issues, let me balance this a little bit. Feynman loved to play bongo drums, and Bob Selby loved to sail and cook. My passion when it comes to using my hands is building. I'm a carpenter, a mason, a Joe the plumber, a roofer. The only thing I don't touch anymore these days is a gas pipe, because I made a bad mistake with it in the past. Whatever else you do, I can recommend that you leave something tangible as well. Here is a very recent example of what I did last summer. Building a dormer window on our barn in Normandy. So this must be the carpenter's gene, because I do this straight from my head, and I don't need a single drawing for it. Building something bound to last is not only satisfactory, it's good diversion from the demands of your real work, especially if you have to manage complex situations. And getting these beams together at just the right angles and just the right slopes is not so different from what you do, say, as a dean in College Hall. You see some glue dripping down there. This is also a metaphor as far as I'm concerned. Don't try to get everything perfect. You either won't start at all on a project, or you will waste precious time that you can better spend otherwise. Merely good is often good enough. Let me pick up my theme again. So, like the generations before me have dealt with great changes in their lifetime, my life has been a theater of great changes. I believe that the future generations, you, will see equally drastic changes in shorter periods of time with fewer intermittent intervals. Today, we all know that we are perilously close to ruining the livelihood of our planet. Those of you who try to have facts first, those of us, I would say, and those who have obscured their own vision with a sign that reads, "Science is just another opinion," we all know. And if we ignore this, it's because each generation finds it hard to look beyond its immediate interests. We all find it hard to kick bad habits. We once had a beautiful Plymouth Valiant, make 1969, a car you can only find in Cuba today. You wouldn't want to be caught dead in it because of its emissions. But we still remember fondly driving it across the United States twice. We cannot expect people in emerging economies to forfeit the right to the same affluence that others have had before them, often at their expense. The formidable global challenge that presents itself here makes it imperative to understand each other, to join forces, to share and to be forgiven across cultures, across distances, and across time. And we have to change our present course fast. A deep sense of awareness of our lives as lasting many generations could help us forge this bond between all human beings. If implementing ideas were just a matter of scientific development, we would still face a huge challenge, but I think it could be done. We are smart enough to generate ideas, but are we willing enough to pursue them together? So how do we reach global inclusion? A way of dealing with each other that appears to be so radically different from what we are doing today. Not just different, it would also imply a major reversal of trends that we see today. The economic crisis breeds social exclusion worldwide. Nationalistic sentiments flare up. There is arguably more tension between generations than constructive dialogue. You can go on. I have no suggestion how we would change this, at least no brief ones, that would fit into this talk. I only strongly feel that such global inclusion should be achieved if we are to be successful, or in the end, even to survive at all. Instead, let me give you one more example from my own experience to convey a feeling of optimism that we might succeed eventually. Then I will come to my conclusion. The rise of China is part of the daunting challenge that I just mentioned. You will all experience this in your proper lifetime in a way that I will not anymore. And you may well contribute to this challenge by going to China to learn, to teach, to share expertise in ways that I will not do anymore in my lifetime. But what will be your baggage when you do all this? How will fellow human beings best understand and respect each other when they try to move forward together to where there are no roads? Let me tell you one more story that is part of my experience but beyond yours, simply because you did not live through those times yourself. A story that you may remember one day and feel its power, the way I felt it. To me, to my wife, it was a moment of revelation. Last year, I represented Utrecht University at the centennial celebration of Tsinghua University. Here, my wife took a picture of me on Tiananmen Square in front of the Forbidden City. How strange it feels to be there. In the same place where tanks rode during the student revolt of 1989. Now you see there's plenty of room to bike. Chinese bike lanes are unlike French ones. Chinese nowadays sit in their cars on the adjacent road anyway. Actually, when we passed by a loaded bus stop, waiting passengers would cheer us and give us thumbs up, as if they were saying that they were happy that at least we were still biking in their city. And here, I took a picture of my wife, properly labeled, in the Great Hall of the People. With our party, we were invited to listen here to Hu Jintao's major address on the next 5 years of Chinese education. It focused on opportunities for Chinese youth who threatened to be left behind in the rapid development of the country. This is the same place where education itself was once scorned, where children were set up against their parents and where farmers were urged to melt down their plows and rice boils for the sake of meeting steel production quota. This is the same country that my PhD advisor could not visit to see his own father. If you live with such perspectives, if you live life of many generations, you're bound to live differently, more restrained and more imaginative at the same time, and perhaps with more compassion. Of course, this experience of mine in China is just an example. There are many others, and the ones that drive the message home are bound to be different for every one of us. At the end of a Sunday, on one of our bike trips, we ended up in Yingshan Park, just north of the Forbidden City. We climbed the hill towards the pagoda. When standing there, we heard singing coming from various corners in the park, as if from birds before nightfall. It was enchanting. So we descended again to find out where the singing came from. Here is what we found. Small impromptu choirs had gathered in many places. It was obvious that people enjoyed being together to sing. It was obvious that they were including us. We were welcome to listen to them. We were no intruders. We felt included. Someone who spoke a little English came over to explain the origin of the song. We didn't know each other's personal history. We didn't speak each other's language. Maybe the very songs we heard represented bitter memories for some people in the choir. We came from vastly different cultures. We had undoubtedly been dealt very different fortunes in life. But none of that mattered in this instant. There was a silently shared understanding of our humanity. I wish we could string such fleeting moments into prolonged experiences, transform them into ways of general conduct between people, nations and generations, into basic attitudes in education and politics. Do we have a fighting chance of taking the direction I'm pleading for? And will we be able to curb current trends in the direction of global inclusion I'm advocating before it is too late? A sense of urgency is definitely there. So that may help. But leaders and role models will be needed. You can be a role model. You can be a leader. You should be role models and leaders. But you don't have to live grand lives, win many prizes, or rule companies or the country. Of course, this would be great. If it happens to you, there's nothing against it. As long as you all live your life as if it lasted many generations. This will help you keep on an even keel, make you more imaginative, and act with better sense of purpose, even though you're traveling to where there are no roads. I realize now that my examples of role models did not include many women outside my direct family, and I'm sure you are waiting for me to make this up. After all, it was Rosa Parks who refused to give up her seat on the bus in Alabama. And it was Marie Curie who won 2 different Nobel Prizes in different fields of science, the only one. So I would like to make this up now by making a prediction for the short term. I think and I hope that Hillary Clinton will become President of the United States in 2016, and this despite her age now. She is extremely well versed in the issues of the time. She has witnessed the lives of ordinary people all over the world, and as far as I can tell, she appears to be doing so with insight and compassion. She personally knows more current and future world leaders than perhaps anyone else. Maybe she can help bridge the gap between personal lives and governments worldwide. Here is a comment I recently read about her in the New York Times. Of course, this was meant to cast some doubt on her capacities well in advance. But to me, it just adds to her qualifications. It shows that she understands that you should only have power in order to serve people, and that there is no big picture without details. Here I come to a close. My story is told, my message is delivered, and my plea is made. I hope some of what I said will resonate with you, with each of you, now or sometime in the future. Sometime in that future, I will stand in the opening of my newly made dormer window in Normandy, inevitably for the last time in my proper lifetime. Then, I'm sure, I will think of my granddaughters and hope that they will once be able to stand in the same spot during my life of many generations, much later in this century. I imagine they will first run a hand over the oak windowsill. Perhaps they will remember the day when they were so excited to see me sand it and cut it down to shape. Then I figure their eyes will turn to the fruit trees, exactly the same old-fashioned trees that were in my grandfather's orchard. These trees have now just started to bear fruit. By then, they will be very old, but I hope that my granddaughters will still be enjoying an occasional apple or pear, just as a sign that we managed to preserve our natural living environment after all. And then they will probably enjoy the sunset like we do now. The sun that will set with iron certainty on all people in the next 24 hours. But I hope with one big difference. We will have learned to live a life of many generations to keep us going to where there are no roads. Thank you.
Last lecture as much as I did, and indeed took something away from this, and maybe not necessarily change entirely the way we live, but at least consider the fact that there will be generations after us, and adapt our lifestyles to accommodate, well, his granddaughters and hopefully our own. Please give another very warm round of applause for Ms. Thompson.